China has declared that the launch of its rocket carrying a new high-resolution remote sensing satellite has failed. I'll be going into why this matters. Also, the Chinese economy is about to take a major hit, and the CCP has been trying to offset this by scrambling to import as many chips as possible before U.S. sanctions kick in. And the Chinese regime is also pushing to create a fighting mentality among the Chinese people, with statements from state-run media and from Xi Jinping himself. I'll be going in-depth into this. Welcome back, everyone. First off, some breaking news. The CCP has declared that the September 12th launch of its Kuaizhou 1A rocket was a failure. The rocket was carrying a new high-resolution remote sensing satellite that the regime was planning to add into its Jilin-1 satellite system. It reported 2 hours after the launch that the satellite failed to enter its orbit and cited abnormal performance. Now, of course, when it comes to satellites, many countries, including the United States, sometimes have failures when it comes to launches. It's not an easy process. But the CCP has been making a large push recently, launching many different satellites into space, and this ties into one of its broader strategic initiatives. Part of this ties into the CCP's creation of a new GPS replacement, its BeiDou satellite system. This is important. Now, what is the interest of the GPS system? What is the use of that? When it comes to the United States, this is part of its military system when it comes to targeting, when it comes to navigation, and so on. Of course, there are commercial uses as well, which are profitable. If the CCP is creating this new satellite system, that means, for example, if there were a war with the United States or a war that the U.S. did not approve of, the CCP previously could have been cut off from the GPS network. And that would mean some pretty interesting things. That would mean its missiles could not find their targets. That would mean that its ships could not as easily navigate. And that would mean that many other navigation systems in China and targeting systems in China would not be useful. The high-tech nature of its military would be disabled. The CCP has understood the strategic interest in this, and it's built instead a new satellite network that it's not only using for itself but also giving to other countries. It recently completed the creation of this satellite network. And so the CCP, with this and with other satellite launches, has been trying to replace the U.S. infrastructure in space, again for China's own interest and for its exports to other countries, allowing other countries access to these networks. Meanwhile, the CCP is allegedly scrambling to import as many chips as possible, these semiconductor chips, before U.S. sanctions kick in. Now, according to multiple Chinese news outlets, including Sina and Sohu, Huawei, this Chinese telecommunications company, has been using a subsidiary company, HiSilicon, to charter flights to carry shipments of chips to China from Taiwan. The reports allege that each flight costs around $205,000. It says Huawei has been doing this in order to purchase as many of these high-tech chips as possible, again before U.S. sanctions on chip sales begin on September 15. Now, Huawei needs the latest generation of its Kirin 9000 chips to produce its new Huawei Mate 40 phone. It allegedly purchased about 10 million of these chips, and this may again give it enough of a stockpile to run production for about half a year, not a long time. And once these chips are gone, Huawei will be locked out from the global market of high-tech chip manufacturers and will be limited instead to domestic chip manufacturers again in China, which are likewise facing pressure from sanctions, and China cannot manufacture current generation chips. And the sanctions include, for example, restrictions even on the equipment that Chinese companies use to manufacture these chips. Now, companies that have stopped their sales of chips to Huawei include major producers, some of the main ones, including Taiwan's TSMC, Samsung, and SK hynix. Samsung and LG are also expected to halt sales of advanced smartphone panels to Huawei starting on September 15. So what does this all mean? The Chinese high-tech economy is about to take a death blow. September 15th, this is going to kick in. Huawei has been trying to offset the timing of that crippling blow. Again, what does this mean for the CCP? Chips are one of the major foundational points of its entire high-tech economy. When it comes to smartphones, laptops, a lot of high-tech equipment, they need these chips. If the CCP cannot import these chips from other countries, then domestically it cannot manufacture current generation chips. Again, when it comes to technology, a few generations makes a huge difference. Now imagine what a 10-year difference means. Now, when it comes to the broader scheme of things, 10 years in terms of technological advancement may not seem like that big of a deal. But think back on where your smartphone was 10 years ago, and think of where it is now. In fact, think of it where it was even 5 years ago. A few generations, even a few years, makes a major difference when it comes to the ability of a company to compete on the global market. And the Chinese economy right now, one of their major pushes, for example, with China 2025, going back, for example, to Project 863, its entire strategic initiative when it comes to state planning on the Chinese economy has been around trying to build these high-tech products. The ban on these chips is the death of that program. The ban on these chips marks the end, at least in the short term, of the CCP's ability to compete on these high-tech products. And this means the CCP is going to have to move back its economic planning to again become the manufacturing hub of the world. Low-tech to mid-range high-tech manufacturing, nothing high-end. And again, also this is important because as companies are pulling their factories out of China, it's losing that as well. And also as Chinese companies brace for the sanctions on chips to kick in, China's own semiconductor companies are facing their own problems. The CCP's own state-run chip manufacturer, HSMC, is facing financial pressure due to a failed deal. And also this deal is important in terms of where it's at. According to Taiwan News, the CCP was planning a large semiconductor project in Wuhan, again the epicenter of this virus, with around $20 billion in investment and with a team of former executives that it had scalped from its rival company in Taiwan, TSMC, one of the world's largest chip manufacturers. And now this program has fallen through. It failed to bring in enough investors, and for the CCP, this is a big deal. This again means that its plans for building domestic capabilities as it's cut off from the world markets is falling through, even despite the fact that it tried recruiting executives from one of the main companies that works on these things. And in addition to this, local reports say that another chip manufacturer in China, Xinhua Unigroup, is facing similar problems. Its bond prices have taken a free fall. It's allegedly planning to form a debt committee to deal with pressure from the growing debt, although the company has denied these claims. And so what does this tell us? It shows that the CCP's contingency plan, its plan to offset the impact of these external bans, has fallen apart. It is in the process of falling apart. Its different plans to build these capabilities inside of China are failing. And so the CCP now is having to face the reality again that its own companies are not going to be capable, very likely, of producing these chips. It's unclear what the cause was inside of China with, again, the investment falling through. Very likely, this could be the fact that different companies that were selling equipment to them to manufacture these chips have also halted the export of those systems. And so again, these companies, in addition to not being able to import these chips, cannot manufacture them themselves because they have to buy the equipment to even build them from outside companies. And these outside companies have again cut off those exports. And now for the broader stories for today. Now first off, the Chinese regime is pushing to create a fighting mentality among the Chinese people, with statements from state-run media and from Xi Jinping, the head of the Chinese Communist Party. Epoch Times has a great analysis on this, which I'll be going into. Now, Xinhua, one of the CCP's main mouthpiece news outlets, published an article on September 5th titled, quote, "Why This Publishing of Xi Jinping Frequently Emphasizes Fighting Psychology." It recounted a speech from Xi Jinping given at the Central Party School of the CCP titled, "Strengthen Fighting Mentality, Reinforce Fighting Capabilities." Now, Xinhua wrote, "The first impression when reading this article is the word fighting permeates throughout the entire piece, from top to bottom." It continues stating the whole article is no more than 2,000 words, but the word fight appears 56 times. Now, in this recounting of Xi's speech, Xinhua called on the Chinese people to deeply understand what it calls, quote, "the great fight." Now, why would Xinhua be pushing for a fighting mentality at this time? We can start by looking at the context of U.S.-China relations. And it would be easy to say it's talking about the direct fight of the CCP against the United States. But there's likely a bit more to it. Xinhua wrote that, quote, "At present, as Xi Jinping pointed out, China's development is entering into a phase full of risks and challenges, and they're surfacing. It is caught in a lot of conflicts, including economical, political, cultural, societal, environmental, defense, army development, Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwan affairs, international affairs, party development, etc. And it said it will become more and more complicated. Now, what does this really say? In Xinhua's statement, it refers to the full picture of the CCP's conflicts, and the conflict with the United States isn't even stated directly. Instead, Xinhua groups this conflict together with the CCP's many conflicts with other countries as just, quote, international affairs. Yet the other items on the list are more telling, as most of what's mentioned are issues of internal conflict within the Chinese Communist Party and within China. It appears that for the CCP, its focus is on internal fighting. And even the topic of international affairs has a strong element of internal fighting, where party leaders have blamed Xi Jinping for causing the international backlash against China after he abandoned the peaceful rise doctrine. Now, this ties into the core interest of the CCP, which is to ensure that the Chinese Communist Party stays in power, and that the party retains the largest share of power in the country. Xinhua asked, quote, "What is the target of the struggle?" And it noted that Xi Jinping emphasized 5 points, stating, quote, "Whatever endangers the leadership of the CCP, whatever risks and challenges endanger sovereignty or security, whatever risks endanger the fundamental interests, whatever impedes the great, quote, rejuvenation, as long as they come, we must fight resolutely and we must win the struggle." Now, it's important to note, the CCP and its mouthpiece news outlets always conflate the Chinese people with the Chinese Communist Party. When they discuss threats to the Chinese people, what they're usually referring to are threats to the party. And the 5 points it mentions play on this idea. And the report talks about threats that may endanger the security of the Chinese nation or Chinese people. What it's referring to are threats to the CCP and its interests. And the emphasis on struggle is important here as well. For the Chinese Communist Party, like all communist regimes, the idea of struggle plays closely into its basic authority and hold on power. When it comes to communist ideology, a foundation of it is dialectical materialism, which is based on the idea of struggle of opposites. This Marxist idea, called the living soul of Marxism, holds that revolution can be started by creating divisions, eliminating the middle ground within those divisions, and then agitating the two sides into open conflict. By increasing antagonisms between different segments of society, the Communist Party is able to latch on to the struggle to manifest its calls for revolution. And this idea even holds for communist regimes that remain in power, with their rolling abusive campaigns and internal purges. The idea is to strengthen the hold of the communist system over the people by embedding its concept of struggle into the culture and ideology of the population. At this time, when Xi is talking about the importance of the fighting mentality, and when the CCP's main state mouthpieces are calling for a new culture of open struggle, the high-profile nature of these statements suggests that the target of this new struggle may soon emerge. Even strategically for the Chinese Communist Party, when it's facing increasing pressure from internal and external conflicts, the regime needs a scapegoat to divert the pressure, which for the interests of the CCP would ease tensions around infighting and reduce external pressure. And given the history of the CCP and the basic patterns it has followed, it's likely this new struggle will be internal. And it's likely as well this ties to Xi's new campaign for a Mao-style purge within the party itself. Now, looking back at the history of the communist system in China, before the CCP was established, Mao Zedong had used the, quote, struggle mentality to fight off political competitors in the party, and through this managed to seize the highest authority of the party, becoming chairman. From there, he continued to eliminate dissenting voices from within party ranks through his bloody Yan'an purge, a purge that the CCP is now invoking directly by name in the new purge campaign launched by Xi. After the CCP was established, Mao faced deep criticism for his repeated mistakes, and he responded by launching the Cultural Revolution to, quote, fight against dissenting party members, and used this as well to overthrow top party leaders. Through these campaigns, he established a position of absolute power within the Chinese Communist Party. After Mao died, the so-called Gang of Four within the CCP was blamed for starting the Cultural Revolution. And when former CCP leader Deng Xiaoping came to power, he again used the struggle mentality tactic to remove Mao's chosen successor, that was Liu Shaoqi, as well as other top leaders, to again clear the way for his own position. And the following move in this chapter of the Chinese Communist Party, during its June 4th Tiananmen Square massacre, Premier Zhao Ziyang was removed through the internal struggle method, and this cleared the way for Jiang Zemin and Li Peng to come to power through that massacre. After Deng Xiaoping's death, Jiang Zemin used the same struggle mentality to eliminate all the powerful figures that Deng Xiaoping had left behind. And now with the party under Xi Jinping has likewise excelled in this system of struggle, and through his purges, mainly under the narrative of fighting corruption, he has removed many CCP officials who were in Jiang Zemin's camp, again following this exact same pattern. As the Epoch Times notes, throughout the Chinese Communist Party's brief history, countless party members have been removed, compromised, and persecuted for the sake of ensuring the party's political stability and to ensure the absolute power of the CCP's top leader. Just by looking at how the party treats its, quote, ardently loyal party members, we can see how it regards the Chinese people, let alone the lives of people for the rest of the world. For the Chinese Communist Party, any and every fight is about the fight of the Chinese Communist Party and not a fight for the Chinese people. The Chinese people are just used by the CCP to carry out fights like this, to perpetuate the internal struggle within the party and throughout the country, to again maintain the dominance of the party. And meanwhile, the Chinese Communist Party is strengthening its systems for financial control. China Banking News reports that the Chinese regime has unveiled a new plan to create a fintech risk control center in Beijing, which suggests it views financial risk as a national security issue. It notes the plan includes 26, quote, key missions, and these include strengthening and reforming the financial services sector and establishing more control over the cross-border flow of funds. The CCP has also shifted to a new policy on its financial sector for, quote, active control when it comes to compliance management. China Banking News also reports on a recent CCP report that states RegTech is gradually shifting from compliance management to active prevention and control, and states that after the CCP has continued to open up its financial services sector, the, quote, strengthening of overall planning, prevention, and control of systemic financial risk and ensuring the secure and healthy development of finances has become ever more important. And so what does this show us? The Chinese regime would not do this if it did not see something happening with its financial systems. It is establishing new systems, new totalitarian systems to more directly control finances and the flow of finances within the country. This ties not just to the active financial systems like we're discussing here, but also to its creation of this new digital currency, something that would allow it to directly control all purchases, all transactions, and the flow of cash inside and outside of China. Again, the Chinese Communist Party appears to be strengthening its control over every sector, and the financial sector is one of them. As we mentioned previously, the Chinese economy and the CCP's own internal admissions is not doing well, but they're telling the rest of the world a very different narrative. If that were not the case, why would they see the need, again, to build systems like this at this time, when the CCP, again, is facing criticisms from outside China on the integrity of its financial system and on the integrity of its different companies in the U.S. stock exchange. Also, the Chinese regime and its own doctrine has been waging war against the United States through information, politics, and finance. And the U.S. government has only recently begun taking actions to counter these operations. To learn more about this, I had the pleasure recently of interviewing Brian Kennedy, chairman of the Committee on the Present Danger China, and also the author of Communist China's War Inside America. Let's jump into that now. Brian, it's a real pleasure having you on Crossroads.
Thank you, Joshua. Great to be with you.
Now, you've written an interesting book. It's kind of a shorter analysis and kind of in-depth explanation on how the Chinese Communist Party has really misled the world while it's launching all these hostile actions, how it has convinced the world otherwise. Tell us about some of this.
The book is really a monograph that is designed for the person who's not going to read a long book about China, but who wants to know something about what's going on in the world today. And I think people are deeply confused about what our relations are with China. Prior to President Trump, Americans had heard that, we may have some problem with China in the future, but we were never the way we are today. And ever since the Trump presidency, we've really had very tough relations, both on trade, but now you see with COVID-19, a almost open hostility between the United States and China. And the United States and President Trump really blaming China for many of the things that are going on, especially the spread of this awful virus in the United States. And my monograph really is trying to explain to people that this is part of a long-term strategy by Communist China to alter the way we Americans think about the world, and really in a way to demoralize us. And this is part of a long-term strategy they have when it comes to the United States.
Now, this is interesting because we hear about Chinese economic theft. We hear about things like, their debt traps. We hear about their different warfare strategies and all this crazy stuff they're doing. But China is still seen as a, normal trade partner with the U.S. and the world. And we hear all these glowing things about them. And so we are getting mixed messages on this. Why would you say that is?
Well, that's a perfect way of thinking about it, because on the one hand, Americans know Chinese people. The ones they encounter on a daily basis just seem like normal, everyday people because they're just people. But Chinese business practices, we know, are designed to steal America's intellectual property. And if America's anything, it's the creation of intellectual property. Where was this discussion being had during the Obama administration or the Bush administration? It wasn't. And so now people are hearing today that there's all these bad things going on, something they haven't heard for a long time. And they're wondering why they haven't heard about it. Why is President Trump bringing it up? And why aren't there business leaders who are affected the most by it mentioning all of this? And one thing I think I argue is partly the Chinese are very good at co-opting our business elites. Those people who are doing business with them on Wall Street, the investment banks, the big tech firms, the people who stand to make a lot of money from communist China, they have not raised the red flag that something bad was going on. It really was President Trump and a group of, I would say, economic nationalists who care about our economic future who raised this as a real concern. But for most Americans, this idea that their intellectual property was being stolen, this is the first time they heard about it during the Trump administration. And again, I think it's because our business elites are more or less convinced that this is just how China does business. They themselves are making money. The average American may not make money, but they certainly will. And that I think is one of the things I'm trying to illustrate in this book.
Now, you hit on a few interesting points. You talk broadly about the warfare intentions behind where the Chinese military is going. You talk about the financial war, you talk about some of the business wars, you talk about some of the political wars. But you hit on something interesting, which in my work I've really done a lot to try to expose as well, which is the influence campaigns. And when we think about academics who are in the pockets of the Chinese Communist Party, journalists who are in the pockets of the Chinese Communist Party, business leaders, and I think most importantly, even politicians. I know this is something you discuss. Can you tell us about this and what the scale is of this in terms of what you've seen?
Well, you've done a great job talking about this on your show, which is things like the Confucius Institutes in American universities, the Chinese Scholars and Students Associations in American universities. The Chinese know that if they reach out and embrace the American elite class in our universities and in business and in journalism, they will have a ready audience of people who are willing to listen to their story. And I won't call it bribery as such, But if you're an academic in a university and you get a chance to travel to China, or you're sponsored at a conference where you receive an honorarium and you're seen as one of the friends of China in your academic work, you'll be rewarded for that. China knows that one part of their soft power is spreading money around both the academic community and the journalistic community in the hopes that they have friends who will have a long-term interest in China being portrayed in a favorable light. And again, this is in stark contrast to what many Americans now are learning about China. Their human rights abuses, their environmental abuses within China itself, their ambitions, China, around the world to become a dominant political and economic power. So you see, what we're seeing really for the first time, and not because of journalism and not because of academia, that China is a strategic threat to the United States. And it really is because of certain politicians, journalists like yourself, who are willing to point this out. But to be clear, you're not mainstream. And the kind of things you and I are talking about today are contrarian. The mainstream media will not talk about this, and this is one of the problems. The mainstream media has its own economic interest in communist China, and so it will not highlight this whatsoever, because if they do highlight this, the Chinese will come to, NBC, CBS, ABC, anybody who has an interest financially in China, and get them to change their message. So it really does take smart, independent voices like yours and others to explain to the American people what's really going on. But again, I want to make it clear, that's contrarian. People don't believe this, or don't believe this in the mainstream media, that they can actually say this and get away with it. They may believe it's true, but they're not making it one of the themes of their regular coverage.
And we'll have the extended version of this interview with Brian Kennedy on our Patreon page for our supporters there. So again, if you haven't already, please join us on Patreon. Now, with that said, folks, we're again broadcasting 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. And also, if you want to support us, again, please join us on Patreon. You can find the link to our Patreon page in the description below. Also, if you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps this channel grow. If you want to go the extra mile, please share this video and please tell a friend or family member about Crossroads. Now, with that said, please take care of yourselves, stay healthy, and stay free.